well, God actually exists, actually has those powers. And so he just exercises them how he wants. You don't need something outside of God to somehow get God to exercise those powers. And so Richard Cross really dismisses it very quickly. There's a bunch of other people who do the same, but yeah, that's one medieval scholar who goes, this is just a particular assumption that doesn't seem plausible and we don't need to make. And that's one of many assumptions I think that's going on in a lot of Fazer's arguments that he doesn't state. So as you guys obviously know, my name is Ryan Mullins. So I did my PhD at the University of St. Andrews, and I finished in 2013, and I did it on divine timelessness and the incarnation. And then after that, I was at the University of Notre Dame at the Center for Philosophy of Religion for a little while, doing research. And then I was at the University of Cambridge teaching philosophy of religion. And then after that, I taught at a boarding school in the US for a little while. And then I had a research position at the University of St. Andrews working on my book on God and emotion. And then after that, I was at the University of Edinburgh for a little bit at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities. And then now I'm in Helsinki at the University of Helsinki at the Collegium for Advanced Studies. So most of my research has been on the nature of God. A lot of the stuff has been on God and time, but I've also published a bunch of papers on disability theology, the incarnation, identity over time, philosophy of emotion, the Trinity. So a bunch of different kinds of issues. At the moment, I'm working on a couple different projects. So one of the projects is my next book, which is on divine temporality. So it's going to be called From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker. And then there's a bunch of other side projects I'm working on panentheism, and I'm working on a book that I'm co-authoring with Jordan Wesling and John Peckham, where we're going to be defending divine passibility in a little bit more detail in a lot more detail than I do in the book God and Emotion. And what else am I doing? John Peckham and I were about to launch a brand new book series on the doctrine of God. So we'll be editing the different volumes that are going to come out just on the nature of God. What else? Oh yeah, and I've also been asked to participate in a bunch of different projects related to God and time and emotions. And then there's going to be a 4 views book on divine simplicity, and so I'm going to be contributing to that. So there's a bunch of different kind of projects I'm working on at the moment.
Okay, that sounds good. So I guess I'll get started with some of the questions. For the first question, what denomination would you consider yourself to be? As far as I know, I think you're Protestant, right?
Yeah, vaguely Protestant, yeah.
Would you consider yourself to believe in the 5 solas, or would you consider yourself you're not that hardcore of a Protestant?
Yeah, not that hardcore of a Protestant. So I'm ordained in what's called the Christian Church, or the Independent Christian Church, which is a very small denomination in America that split with the Church of Christ sometime around, I think it was just after the American Civil War. So this is a movement that there's a group of people in Scotland in the early 1800s who were just kind of tired of denominational stuff and decided they wanted to go to the New World to get away from it all. Instead of being Presbyterian or Methodist or Church of Scotland, Church of England, any of that stuff, they just wanted to go to the New World and just be Christian. And so it's a very bare bones kind of Christianity. So we don't even, the best we have are some slogans like no creed but Christ and Bible names for Bible things and stuff like this. There's not actually a lot of great thinkers that come out of this tradition. And there's not a lot of content to it other than you try to be biblical, you try to be reasonable, and that's really about it. Yeah.
I see. For the next question, it's just concerning sort of your denomination and your kind of worldview in relation to that. So the first question is, how do you arrive at the knowledge of the canon of Scripture? If it's through the Church Fathers, it would seem you take them to be an authority on canon, but not other dogma like divine simplicity, the Eucharist, baptismal regeneration, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've never understood. So there's this debate going on right now. It's been going on for a while of like, how do we come to get the canon? And there's a whole weird historical mess there trying to figure out how exactly do we get the canon, because it's not like a church council came together and said this is the canon. But and then somehow if the church fathers did decide this is the canon, then somehow they're supposed to have authority. And I don't understand why that would be the case. Because say a bunch of mathematicians get together and they figure out, these are the different mathematical equations and the right axioms and whatnot. And would you say like, will they have authority on all things mathematics, or did they just discover that this is the mathematical axioms? And I feel like the same thing you could say about the church fathers is that they're discovering certain things. They're discovering these are the more reliable sources, and these other ones they're not so reliable. So therefore, they should have the ultimate authority in all things related to the. I've never really understood what the argument's supposed to be. So how we got the canon, I don't know. I just honestly do not fully understand the story. But how I see the canon is you've got a set of texts that most people in this broadly Judeo-Christian tradition have held to be authoritative for one reason or another. And then when it comes to the New Testament, the set of documents that are the closest to Jesus Christ in terms of history, and the closest in terms of people who would have been around to try to figure out how to around him and around his followers to figure out what exactly the teaching should look like. Those are the ones that are more reliable if my goal is to try to understand who Jesus is and what his teachings were. So whichever documents give me that stuff, I'll go for those.
I see.
Yeah.
What are your views of justification? Do you affirm forensic or transformative, or some other view?
Oh gosh, I don't actually have a view on justification because it's such a ridiculously complicated topic. I feel like the biblical accounts underdetermine what the theory of justification is supposed to be. And when I've read a bunch of different things on like this supposedly like the new theory of justification and these debates about like what was Paul really saying, I really get lost very quickly. I really do. As far as I can tell, it's what makes me right doesn't necessarily mean it's just God declaring that I forgive you, and I'm going to make sure that all those who thirst after righteousness will actually be made righteous in the end. Anything above and beyond that, I really don't know what to say, because all atonement theories, all justification theories, I find them very, very complicated, and I don't know.
Okay. Jonathan asks, do you hold a neo-Apollinarian view of Christology, similar to William Lane Craig? If so, in what sense is Christ fully human if he didn't have a fully human mind/intellect?
Mm-hmm. I don't know which view of the incarnation I hold. Craig's view, as far as I can tell, is very coherent, which is better than I can say for most views. This objection of is how can it really be a fully human mind? I think Apollinaris himself answered this question very well. So here's the backstory of how this slogan gets up and running. So the slogan that he didn't have a fully human mind was because, or it wasn't really fully human, is because people started looking at Apollinaris when Apollinaris said he was the heavenly man. And so they claimed that Apollinaris was saying that Jesus got his flesh from heaven. And so then people were like, oh, well, you don't have a really fully human, Christ. And he's like, I never said that. I said he's the heavenly man because that's just what the Bible says. He got his flesh from Mary. What are you talking about? And then some other people were like, well, you mindlessly believe in a mindless savior. And he's like, well, he is a rational soul. What does it mean to be a human person? To be a rational soul employing a human body. All of us agree on that. And that's a good safe bet at that time, because that was a very popular view in the early church of what it does mean to be a human is to be a rational soul employing a human body. Christ was already a rational soul. All he needed to be human was just to get a human body. So there you go. He's fully human. What more do you want? And I think Craig can say the exact same thing. So this objection, I think it's playing kind of fast and loose with some different ideas here.
I see. Do you hold to? Oh, Sorry. Okay, what do you think of universalism? Setting aside theological concerns, wouldn't a universalist God be more defensible philosophically than one who allows either eternal conscious torment or annihilation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So say like scripture doesn't matter, whatever denominations you're attached to doesn't matter, just like purely on like philosophical grounds alone. Um, I think this is really tricky because part of the question is how do you get the universal salvation?
Well,
S-
let's say
Mhm,
they have to endure like temporary punishment for
mhm.
whatever like crimes they committed that were like truly like heinous, right? Not like minor stuff, right?
Right. Yeah. So like, you got your war criminals. They're definitely going to suffer for a little while. So yeah, so TJ Mawson has this. What's the phrase he uses? God literally scares the hell out of you, and that's how you get into heaven eventually. Because so
Yeah,
Mawson thinks
something
like,
like that.
yeah, exactly, yeah. So this woman named Ayana Patsaladu, she has this particular argument that goes like this. She's like, okay, it seems like a perfectly loving God's going to give you universal salvation. Okay, well, how does he get it? Well, he's got to really punish these people until they eventually acquiesce and just concede and go, okay, God, you're right. And doesn't it seem like God's beating the hell out of these people? In which case, that's coercion, and that goes against this whole idea of there being like free will. And is that really like is that really a good conversion if you have to beat the hell out of these people? Oh, this sounds really bad. Sounds morally dubious, um, and that doesn't sound like a good start to a relationship, especially like an eternal loving friendship of some sort. So these are the sort of claims that why I think it's complicated because you have to try to answer the question of how do you get the universal salvation, and if it's supposed to
Well,
be on the basis of free will, then you're going to have these kind of problems. So yeah, go ahead.
yeah, well, what if it's well, like in her, I guess, like scenario or analogy, she's thinking of it more like them being beaten until they concede, whereas I think most universalists think of it more like the people already want to go to heaven, right? But they have to be cleansed in order to get there. It's sort of like purgatory,
Mhm.
right? So the point is that like like most rational, like sane people wouldn't say, yeah, like I want to go to hell, right? Most would say, yeah, like I want to be in heaven, right, with God,
Yeah,
right? Especially like if you, I don't know if you've heard of like David Bentley Hart and what he's taught says about like rational beings and like goodness. So, like once you know what the good is, so like directly, you sort of want to pursue it, right?
yeah,
Um, however, in order to do that, they need to be cleansed of like earthly sin, and so that's the point of like punishment, right?
right.
It's to be it's reconciliatory.
Yeah, and so that's what Pat Saladin actually focuses in on. So this is written before David Bentley Hart's book. So she's focusing on John Hick, Marilyn Adams, and Thomas Talbot. And as far as I can tell, pretty much everything that they say is what David Bentley Hart says. So they've got this account of if you know what the good is, then you're going to do it. Um, whatever action you think is good, that's the one you do. So, well, you do a bunch of stuff that's not good. Well, that's because of your ignorance, or because you're self-deceived, or you've got the wrong desires. And so Talbot and these other guys and Marilyn Adams, they'll go, okay, well, what God needs to do is get rid of all that stuff. And so what Pat Saladin does is she focuses in on those accounts of how does God get rid of that stuff, and that's where she's like, this looks coercive. This looks like it's ooh, a bit manipulative. And I don't know what to do with that because I really want universal salvation. I think that'd be pretty great. But I need a story that of how you get it without it being manipulative. And the ones I've seen so far, I'm not fully convinced yet.
Okay, I see. All right. We'll take some other questions. Let's see. There's one about time. Actually, several. Okay, so do you hold to a theory of time? If so, what is the truth maker for the statement Socrates once existed? What is the referent if not Socrates existing back in time?
hmm Yeah, so I hold the A theory, and not just any A theory, but presentism, because the A theory. So the A theory is just an account of how you order events, and so it says you order events in terms of past, present, and future.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got propositions that are tensed propositions, which describe things as was the case, is the case and will be the case.
Yeah.
And that's compatible with a bunch of different ontologies of time, or stories about which moments of time exist. So one story is presentism, which says only the present moment exists. Another one would be a growing block where the past, present, and future exist. Then you could also have something called a moving spotlight theory, which you've got an eternal block where all past, present, and future moments exist, but there's somehow this mysterious spotlight that's going all around pointing like that's the present, and now that's the present, and now that's present. So those are all consistent with A theory. And so any of those other than presentism can give you your standard answer to these truth maker questions, because they've got the past literally existing. Now, if you want to be a presentist like me, then you can't do that because you don't think the past exists. But that's okay, because you've got a bunch of stuff in the present that can exist, that can ground all these truths. So one thing you could do is you could say something about God. God's got certain what are called tensional properties, or sometimes called Lucretian properties, properties that point towards the past. So being the sort of thing that once sustained Socrates in existence. So that'd be a part of the story. And so you could say that's part of the way the world is such that, God has this tensional property of having once sustained Socrates in existence. If you're a Christian, then you've got some other resources you can appeal to. One of which is, if you believe in the intermediate state, the place where all the souls go after death and before resurrection, well, Socrates is there. He's in the intermediate state. So Socrates exists right now. And so he's the one who has the tensional property of having once existed. And he has the present property of presently existing. So, there you go. Got a whole bunch of stuff to ground all these truths. But one thing you could do, which is starting to become more popular, if you are really nerdy and deep into the philosophy of time literature, is a bunch of people who even don't like presentism at all will say, this truthmaker stuff's really crazy. It commits you to all sorts of wacky, weird, bizarre stuff that none of us signed on to. And so this just can't be right. Maybe we don't really need this truthmaker story at all. Maybe instead, it just is the case that's what happened in the past. There's no further story to tell. Once something becomes true, once it's made true, that's that. You don't need the truthmakers to continue to exist. There's a few other stories I can tell, but I guess I'll just stop there.
I see. Can you elaborate on what you mean by tensional properties? And does this imply that God would change throughout time, right? Like he's not just changeless in time, but he actually changes throughout time.
Oh, yeah. So tensional properties are properties that are either they're tensed, meaning they like point backwards to like the way things were, or they point forwards to the way things will be. And so these are properties that things presently have. So you have the property of being such that you were born on whatever date you were born. I have the tensional property of being born on July 26, 1983. So that's a tensional property that I have. And so everything that exists that's temporal is going to have a bunch of these tensional properties about, I used to be a baby. Okay, well, that's a tensional property that I have. So if you want God to have tensional properties, you're going to have to make God temporal. And so I'm fine with that. Not everybody's going to be happy with that. So if you want a timeless God, you can't use this as your truth maker. But if you got a temporal God, you can use this as your truth maker.
I see that. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Let's see. So, are you a Molinist? If not, how do you reconcile divine foreknowledge and free will?
So I quite like Molinism. I've got some worries about it, but I'm sticking with it until I'm fully convinced. Because one is the so-called grounding objection. But if there's a bunch of people now who are going, all this truth maker and stuff, that whereas where you get the grounding objection from, if that's all crazy and we don't need it, then maybe, I'm not certain yet, maybe it's not going to be a problem then for Molinism. But but here's a caveat though, is Molinism doesn't give you a story about how foreknowledge and free will are reconciled. But yeah, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Oh yeah, so I was actually going to say, so under Molinism, from my understanding, God just knows that if you're an agent, if you're the type of agent, right, to do X under conditions Y, you will freely choose to do X under the conditions Y, right?
Yeah.
But if that's the case, that just seems like it's just the compatibilism, right? Because you're saying, well, the agent will always choose X under the conditions Y, and I'm not exactly sure how that's supposed to be like free, right? Like how, like what explains why, right? I'm not sure if this is if this is the grounding objection, but like
No.
that's my understanding. Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, so I can explain this stuff a little bit more if you want. So free will is one question of what is free will. And so a lot of people historically would say free will is your ability to perform an action. So you're the source of your action,
Uh-huh.
and your ability to do otherwise. And so that's just free will. There's a second question though: is free will compatible with being determined? And so if you say yes, it is, then and there is in fact determinism in the world, and there is in fact free will in the world, then you're a compatibilist. If you say no, they're not compatible, and there is no determinism in the world, and there is free will in the world, then you're an incompatibilist and a libertarian. And so the Molinist wants to say libertarianism. So they want to say free will is all that stuff I just described, and it is not compatible with being determined, and there isn't this determinism in the world, and there is free will in the world. Now, how do you get God knowing what you would freely do in any possible circumstance when you don't even exist? Don't exist at all. Because when God knows this stuff, it's before he's even decided what to create. Because he's supposed to use this kind of middle knowledge, this knowledge of what you'll do in all these possible circumstances. That's supposed to guide him to figure out which kind of world he wants to create. So the grounding objection is asking, well, what makes that stuff true about what I would do in any possible circumstance? So that's the grounding objection.
Ah, okay, right. But the objection, what about the objection like I would raise, saying that, well, if he has knowledge that you would do X under conditions Y, right? Like the question is like how isn't that just determinism, right? Because he's saying you will necessarily do X under conditions Y, right?
Oh, this is where the Molinist story gets kind of weird. It's just contingently true that you would do that. It's not necessarily true that you would do that. It's just contingently true that you would do that.
But if that's the case, what if, let's say, I decided to do otherwise? What would
Mhm.
happen to God's knowledge then?
Oh, right. So, well, if you did decide to do otherwise, well, it would be contingently true that that's what you would do. And this is the way the Molinist is going to say. So it's just there's just a bunch of contingent facts before God even decides that do describe accurately. This is what will in fact happen if you create a world like this. These people will do these things, but it's all just contingently true that this is in fact what they will do. So it sounds kind of like what you're doing is trying to build some necessity in there, where the Molinist is going to go, no, 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 no. There's no necessity here. When these are contingently true. Uh, and so what a lot of people do, this is where the grounding objection comes up, is so much as people going, well, but what makes that stuff true? Like, how could it be true? It's got to be necessary. And the Molinist is like, no, it's not. It's not. So that's kind of where that's where I get a bit nervous. Is this issue? So not the fact that there would be necessity there, but what makes it true when there is no necessity.
Yeah, that also seems like a problem for like Catholics, because then you have to say that like his knowledge is contingent, which means like he has like properties in his like mental content that's contingent, but they want to say he's like divinely simple and like nothing in him is contingent. So that seems like an issue there as well. Like if you're committed to divine simplicity.
Yeah, and so Joe Schmidt and I just had a paper published. Well, it's in the forthcoming section of religious studies called the aloneness argument, and this is exactly what we latch on to, because when you look at all the major thinkers in the Catholic tradition, just in the Western Christian tradition as a whole, um, they do think that God has contingent knowledge, and it's really explicit, especially when you start looking at when you get to the Scholastic era, and there's all these really detailed debates about God's predestination and providence and all that. It really is the case that God could have done otherwise, that what happens in the future is a contingent state of affairs that is determined by God in some sense, be it because he causally determines it, or you got your Molinist story where he just kind of declares that it's going to be, but it's not fully determined. So you've got just everywhere. There's contingent knowledge going on, and so what Joe and I are doing are like, well, hang on, how are you going to square that with simplicity? Because anything that's in God is identical to God. So, if God's got some contingent knowledge, well, then that contingent knowledge needs to be identical to God. Well, something contingent can't be something identical to something that's necessary because God necessarily exists. Ooh, this doesn't make any sense. This doesn't make any sense. So this is a serious problem, but we're working from premises that we're just identifying that everybody accepts and then drawing out the undesirable entailments.
Yeah, it's like an internal critique, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But my understanding of their response is that they just want to say that God's contingent knowledge is extrinsic, and they'll either, like for example, one account they'll give is that it, like, his creating things is like cognitional. Like, that's the word they use. It's cognitional. So when he sustains events in time, or he creates things, right? That process of creation, like, is his knowledge, essentially. But that just seems very weird, and like, I don't understand what they're even trying to say there. Like, I just don't think that that's what we mean when we say God is all knowing, right?
I would hope that's not. I don't think it's what anybody ever meant. And so Matthews Grant is the one who's been trying to develop this more recently. But before Grant did this, though, there's a few other people who are kind of toying around with it. And Brian Leftow has this really interesting paper on divine simplicity where he briefly considers this extrinsic account of knowledge and extrinsic account of action. And Leftow just says, this is just pure magic. It doesn't actually explain anything. It doesn't do anything. It's just pure magic.
Yeah.
And So I think that's right. To go further, though, I can give a more, I think, devastating critique. So if extrinsic knowledge is just states that God has like beliefs or something, it's just there's a bunch of stuff out in the world. Well, then I have extrinsic knowledge by that case, and I have omniscience. You could be like, well, you don't know stuff like internally, and I'm like, that's fine. I am omniscient because there's all these facts that exist out in the world, and I've got extrinsic knowledge. You can't prove me wrong because sure, I don't know all the stuff that's happening, but it is happening, and that's all it takes to have extrinsic knowledge is that there's this stuff out there in the world happening.
Yeah.
So I'm omniscient. There we go.
Yeah, I agree. It's, to me, just like nonsense. But yeah, so we have some other questions. We have one from B3. Which response to your criticism of divine simplicity caused you to think the most or doubt your view?
I'm trying to think through because there's been a lot of responses. It's hard to say because I want to say it's only recently where I've seen meaningful responses. Because for the first, when I first developed this stuff in 2011, all the responses were, "You've misunderstood Aquinas. You haven't read enough Aquinas. You just need to read more Aquinas." And I'm like, well, I'm quoting everybody and their mother because some of these papers, I don't know if you guys have read them. The amount of stuff I quote is just obnoxious to a lot of people, but because everybody kept saying this sort of thing, and then the other responses were just mystery, mystery, mystery. So I didn't get any meaningful responses until I would say within the last like 2 or 3 years. But so far, none of them have shaken me yet, because most of them I can quickly identify where I think they go wrong. I take that back. There's this guy named John Leno. He has a paper that finally came out in religious studies, where he's trying to come up with a response to the possibility objection that I raise in one of my first papers on it, where it seems if God's supposed to be purely actual, well, then you're not going to get God being able to do otherwise. And so there's some kind of inconsistency between pure actuality and all this potential other stuff that God's supposed to be able to do. And so what John did there was he was like, well, there's all this really cool literature on the metaphysics of powers going on around right now. And so he's like, I'll just develop that and say God's got all these powers, and here's a kind of story you can kind of tell. And that gave me pause for a while. It took me a few months before I realized what was wrong with it. And so here's what's wrong with it is if you say that God has powers, powers are properties. So when you're looking at a lot of the contemporary literature on the metaphysics of powers, those are considered to be properties. Well, divine simplicity says God has no properties. So if you want to try to use this sort of move to be like, oh, well, God's got all these powers, then you're going to be saying God has properties. And, well, divine simplicity says no properties. So you've just said something that's inconsistent with divine simplicity. And so I was like, okay, there we go. I got a way out of this response to my objections.
All right. We have another question from B3. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit though. Do you think that God is prone to things like Cartesian skeptical scenarios? So like, how would God know that he's all-knowing, right? And if he knew that he was all-knowing, how would he know that he knew that he was all-knowing, and so on and so forth?
Oh, right. I see. Oh gosh, I am so out of touch with epistemology that I really don't know. I know typically the response to get out of Cartesian skepticism is to try to play like some sort of externalist account of epistemic justification. But a lot of people go, well, but surely God would know how he knows things and know that he knows and knows that he knows, and on and on and on. Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. My response to skepticism in general is just to go, why should I think that any of that is in fact the case? Like, sure, it's possible, but lots of things are possible. Why is it plausible? And the idea of an all-knowing God being in a skeptical scenario like that, I just find deeply implausible. So just the mere possibility, actually, I don't even know if it would be a possibility because I just don't know what it would mean for a all-knowing being or a being with some kind of maximal cognitive excellency to be in a skeptical scenario. So I don't know. I guess I'd just be skeptical that this skeptical scenario is even possible. Yeah.
I guess, you'd be skeptical about the skepticism.
Yeah. That's my cheeky response. My real response is, gosh, I'm so out of touch with epistemology. I don't know.
Okay, we have another question from B3. What is the reason that God would exist rather than nothing? I don't mean why he exists. Okay, so I guess he's just asking, like, what is the reason God exists? Like, why is he necessary? That's the question.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I don't know how to quite answer this because if you look at different arguments for why you need a necessarily existent being, it's because that's it's usually because like that's where explanation stops. It's a natural stopping point for explanations. And so then whatever that necessary being is, there's different arguments for why it has those different properties. And so if you think God is that necessary being, I mean, that's just where the explanation stops. So why would God be a necessarily existent being? I guess I don't quite understand the question because I don't because it sounds like the question would be like this: why is the necessarily existent being a necessarily existent being?
Yeah.
So maybe I'm missing something though. Maybe rephrase the question again because I feel like I might be missing something.
Yeah, maybe I could just ask a follow-up. What is your account of like metaphysical necessity, right? Like, because it seems like when you're talking about something metaphysically necessary, like it's logically possible that God doesn't exist, right? Presumably, like, so what does it mean to say that it's metaphysically necessary? It seems like you're just positing some sort of like brute fact that for whatever reason like couldn't have been otherwise, right? It's like it's just brutally it's just a brute fact that it couldn't be otherwise, right? It's like unexplained and logically contingent.
Yeah, on some accounts that is the case. So, because things are logically necessary if supposedly if you deny them, you get a contradiction. Whereas with metaphysical necessity, it's not clear that you get a contradiction if you deny them. But you might be able to derive something when you reflect on the nature of the thing. You might be able to get at some kind of contradiction. So T.J. Mawson has this sort of argument in his book, The Divine Attributes, where he's like, well, we all have to admit there's certain things that are metaphysically necessary. I can't remember how the argument goes now, actually, thinking about it. No, this is terrible. I shouldn't have brought it up then if I can't reconstruct the argument. No, I shouldn't have brought it up then. Yeah. The conclusion of this argument that I cannot for life of me remember is that when you're trying to consider lots of different things that we all do, you're going to have these different metaphysically necessary things in your ontology no matter what. Certain different like fundamental principles that you think are true, that if you deny them, you don't get a logical contradiction, but that's not terribly interesting. So like principles of causation, principles of maybe say like mathematical principles, moral principles. And so God would just be another one of those. That's a terrible answer because I can't for life of me remember how the argument goes.
Okay, I see. What is your view? So Jonathan asks, what is your view of the Kurtzman eternity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if anybody's read The End of the Timeless God, you might have noticed I just dismissed the view in a footnote. And here's why. So lots of people who affirm divine timelessness, and then lots of people who reject divine timelessness, think that this ET simultaneity stuff that Kurtzman and Stump are up to is vacuous. It's completely circular and vacuous. And here's what that means. So they originally proposed to give a story of how a timeless being can interact with a temporal world. And so they give this kind of story about how, well, it's eternal, it's present, it's somehow simultaneous, but it's not with all moments of time, but those moments of time are not simultaneous with each other. And they just kind of like assert that. A bunch of people push back going, but how does this work? You told us you were going to explain how this worked. All you did was just assert that it works. And all of the responses that they gave were just reasserting it does work. But the whole point was supposed to be an explanation for how it works. And since they didn't explain how it works, and that's what we need, then it's vacuous. And so that's one of the many critiques that a lot of people give. And like I said, most people who affirm divine timelessness, a lot of big names like Catherine Rogers, Paul Helm, Brian Leftow, they offer very similar critiques and go, we don't need it. This doesn't explain anything. Here's another problem I think with it. And this is, I think, a very serious problem. And I've asked Eleanor about this on multiple occasions and have never gotten an answer. I need to know what ontology of time they're working with. Is this a presentist story? Is it an eternalist story? Is it, something else? Like, tell me. And I have never gotten an answer on this at all. And so someone like Paul Helm and Catherine Rogers, what they do is they go, if you've got an eternalist ontology of time, well, we've got an actual story we can tell you about how God relates to, how a timeless being relates to time. Stump and Kurtzman didn't give you one. Well, we're doing really good then because we actually gave you one. So we don't even need ET simultaneity because we're going to give you an actual story. I think that's right.
I've listened to Eleanor Stump describe this, and like it seems like she's saying that it's like B theory for God, like eternalism for God and presentism for us. Like it's very confusing the way she describes. I mean, personally, this just seems to confirm my priors that like a lot of things that classical theists, like a lot of the bullets they bite, are extremely counterintuitive and very like it's not even clear what they're trying to express.
Sometimes it's that way. Other times, I would be more charitable and say like, okay, they got something going on here. That's not quite as counterintuitive as I thought. But there are a bunch of cases like this one where I think this one's not a good move, and that's why in my work I usually focus on people like Helm and Rogers, who they're going to go, that makes no sense. I'm going to give you more details, more content to the story of classical theism. But I do want to say that like now they've just bashed Eleanor a bunch. A lot of her work I really do like. I think she's done some really good stuff. I just don't. This one I just don't. I don't think is that great.
I see. Okay, so we have some questions from Alex Strasser. Okay, so on the relationship between philosophy of religion, analytic theology, and theology, do you think there is a big disconnect between philosophers of religion and theologians? If so, why do you think that is? For example, it seems that common theological terms are often ambiguous between multiple philosophical views.
Mm-hmm. So when I first started out doing my master's and then eventually my PhD, I kept hearing this claim that philosophers of religion, in particular analytic philosophers, and then the analytic theology movement was just starting when I was doing my master's. There was this claim that it's ahistorical, it's not really connected to theology, it's not very biblically informed, and all this kind of stuff. And I thought that was just nonsense. because when you look at some of the people who are, like, say, editing the Cambridge Companion to Aquinas, the Cambridge Companion to Anselm, the Cambridge Companion to Boethius, all this kind of stuff. And those people like Eleanor Stump and Norman Kretzmann, and then you've got like these medieval scholars like Marilyn Adams and whatnot. And I'm like, can't really be ahistorical if they're experts on a historical time period. What's going on here? Then when I went deeper into my studies, I kind of realized, okay, there are a bunch of cases where there are philosophers of religion who are just like, here's this concept, here's this word. Well, I can mean whatever I want by it, so it means this. And I'm like, that's not what anybody throughout the entire church tradition has ever said. Like, you're just taking that concept of, like, so here be an example of this. So impassibility, which means that God cannot suffer, cannot be causally influenced or moved by anything outside of himself, and cannot have an emotion that is inconsistent with his perfect rationality, perfect moral goodness, and perfect happiness. And I don't know how many times I read a philosopher of religion who was just like, it could just mean God suffers when he wants to. That's fine. And I'm like, that's not what the view has ever meant. No one's ever once thought that. What are you talking about? This is crazy. And so I was like, oh gosh, okay, maybe there is something to this. Maybe there is some kind of disconnect here where people are not really considering what is historically accurate and this kind of stuff. But I don't think it's unique to philosophers of religion, because this is something I point out in my first book. I can point out a bunch of scholars who are like Barthian scholars. They just think that all theology ends and begins with Karl Barth. Nothing happened before Karl Barth. Nothing's happened since. They're very ahistorical. They don't know anything about like church history because all they know is Karl Barth. And it's people who do the same thing with Aquinas. They only know Aquinas. They don't know anything before and after. And so I'm like, oh, this isn't really a problem that's unique to philosophers of religion. This is a problem that happens for all of us because it's really hard to be interdisciplinary. It's really hard to sit down and do all your homework on church history and do all your readings on like contemporary cutting edge philosophy and do all, insert anything else. So this is just, I think, a problem that just plagues anybody who's trying to do interdisciplinary work or is just refusing to do interdisciplinary work. So I think that's one of the explanations of what's going on in the background is just it's really hard to do all this stuff, to keep all these things in your mind.
Okay. This person also asks a follow-up. How important do you think it is for philosophers to provide full philosophical accounts of theological concepts or divine attributes, precise analytic formulations, necessary and sufficient conditions, etc.? Do you think this is important for progress, truth, clarity, or understanding?
I don't know exactly how important it is because I can't give like a precise value on that. I can't be like, well, it's a 0.9, and where 1 is like the highest value. But I do think it is very valuable for certain reasons. One, I just want to know. I want to have a nice story, a philosophical account of the nature of God. It brings a lot of value to me personally in my own search for the truth, in my own understanding, in my own faith and practice. So for me, yeah, I would put the value quite high. I don't think everybody needs to be doing that because somebody's got to do all the other stuff that's going on that needs to be done. But I think it's very good that some people try to do this. How much precision can you get? As much as you can. I don't know how much that is, though. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how much precision we can get, but I am happy to keep pushing until I can get as much precision as I possibly can.
All right. So, Kant asks, how do you distinguish the persons in the Godhead prior to creation?
Oh, yeah. So I've written on this a few times. So prior to creation, I would say that the persons are distinguished by the fact that they're simply 3 centers of consciousness, each with their own will. But then I can add even more. So a person is a center of consciousness, and because of that, they have a first-person perspective. And so if you've got 3 divine persons, you're going to have 3 first-person perspectives. Further, persons have what are called de se beliefs. So beliefs about myself. I do this, I do that. I am the Father. And the other one's going to have, I am the Son. And the other person's going to have, I am the Holy Spirit. But all those are grounded in the fact that you've got 3 centers of consciousness, each with their own will.
I see. My follow-up to his question is, So if there are three centers of consciousness, how do you, I guess, unify them? Like, what keeps them from being three gods separate?
Hmm. Yeah. So that's the main challenge to this kind of view. Um, the best I've been able to see is you've got a lot of debates about what exactly is monotheism. Like, what would it mean to have one God? And so Keith Yandel has this sort of account of like he's like, well, look, let's look at Maximus Confessor, let's look at the Cappadocians, let's look at John Duns Scotus, and a bunch of others. What they say is what makes them three persons and one God and not three gods is that the persons are inseparable. So what you can say is the divine persons are necessarily and essentially internally related to one another, such that it is impossible for them to exist apart from each other. So that's one of the many conditions that Keith Yandel gives, but that one's I think one of the more important ones. So some kind of inseparability thesis. So if you had three gods, the idea would be like, well, they really are completely separate entities. Whereas on this account, it'd be like, well, no, it's impossible for them to exist apart from each other. They are in some sense like what the technical phrase in theology is called perichoretically related to one another. I can't
see.
really give more of a story than that, but yeah, that's the basics.
All right. Cut also asks, is it true that your view is that the doctrine of eternal generation results in the Father being ontologically greater than the Son because the Father is unbegotten and the Son isn't?
Yeah, that's my view.
Okay. What do you make of the response to that? Causation is a hypostatic property, not an ontological one. The fathers give the analogy of Adam being unbegotten, i.e., not begotten by any human being, and the cause of Seth and Eve. Yet all three share the same human essence. Does the fact that Adam is not begotten by any human person make me or you less human?
Right. So this is where the analogy with Adam breaks down. So part of what it means to be divine is to have the property of aseity. And so the property of aseity is this. A being exists a se if and only if its existence is not dependent upon nor derived from something else. That's not a property that Adam or Seth or any of the other humans have. None of them have aseity because all of them are creatures. They're all dependent upon something else. So if God the Father wants to have like cause other things to be divine, I think that's impossible because anything that God the Father would cause to exist could not, by definition, have the property of aseity because, again, something that has aseity is its existence is not dependent upon nor derived from anything outside of itself, whereas the Father is supposed to be unbegotten, uncaused, ungrounded, whatever you want to say, and the Son, according to Council of Nicaea, is caused, is derived from the Father, and the same thing for the Holy Spirit. So, by definition, you just can't have aseity.
I see.
So yeah.
But wouldn't your view of the Trinity also be a problem for aseity because the Godhead depends on the three persons being like connected or related in some way, right? Such that if they weren't, then God, uh, the Godhead wouldn't really be a thing, right?
Yeah. This gets pushed a bunch of times, and I've never understood the force of this because on a social model of the Trinity, when you talk about the Godhead, that just is the three persons, and so it's acting like the Godhead is this other thing, and the persons are this completely separate thing. Whereas on the social model, it's just like when I say the word God, what I'm doing is just referring to the three divine persons.
I think they want to. I think the objection is sort of like that. It's some sort of like partialism, like the three consciousnesses make a whole God. Whereas if there was just one person, it wouldn't be like God. Like,
Um, yeah, I guess I just don't understand this because I don't think the persons are a part whole relation. Because I think parts and wholes is only. I would really I think parts and wholes applies mainly to like physical objects. I don't know if it really applies to non-physical objects.
okay, what do you think is the best argument for God's existence?
Oh gosh, um, I, I don't know. I really like a lot of the arguments from contingency. Um, I never liked the ontological argument when I was younger, but then when I was reading Eugen Nagasawa's Maximal God book, that ontological argument, the way he defends it, that's a thing of beauty. Like it's really elegant. So yeah, normally I would say like arguments from contingency, those are my favorite, but I'm starting to kind of gain a greater appreciation for the modal ontological argument.
See. Okay, so sorry. Next up, I want to unmute Jonathan and let him ask some questions. So, Jonathan, you can ask him some questions.
Hi. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. I was just wondering, could you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So you said you liked contingency arguments, and one of the questions I kind of had was, obviously that commits you to a PSR. So do you hold what is your view of the PSR?
Mm-hmm. So there's a bunch of different PSRs, and that's one of the things I liked about Josh Rasmussen's. I'm mainly familiar with his earlier work on the contingency arguments. I haven't read his more recent stuff on it yet. So one of the things he does in some of his earlier papers is point out there's a bunch of different PSRs, and so what you have to do is you have to just pick one you want, and then that's how you start to construct an argument. So some PSRs seem like really strong. So like Leibniz seems like he's got a PSR and he wants to build a bunch of other stuff into it as well that might get you some kind of modal collapse or something like that. And that seems pretty bad. Whereas like Samuel Clarke's like, well, I've got the PSR too, but I don't want to build anything else into it. All I'm saying is contingent stuff just needs an explanation. That's all. Nothing above and beyond that. Nothing fancy. And so I think something like that seems right to me.
Okay. Yeah, and I wanted to follow up. So you believe that a necessary fact can cause contingent fact, right?
I would think a necessary being, if it has the right sort of properties, could cause.
Like God.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas I don't think facts. Well,
like propositions.
It depends what you think a fact is, because people are always really fuzzy on what facts are. So I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Yeah, because part of one of the modal collapse objections to classical theism seems to rely on, if God is a wholly necessary being with no intrinsic contingent items, then he can't cause a contingent world. And I feel like let's take a view like what's called a theistic personalist view, although I know it's not a term that's I don't think you have used, but like on that view, there are like some intrinsic contingent features of God that are supposed to kind of solve this problem of what the problem is supposed to be with classical theism. But I feel like you could just push that question back a step and ask, well, what is the relationship between God's necessary essence and his contingent desires or contingent intrinsic acts or whatever? So I was just wondering how you'd respond to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I'm about to say is a very poorly remembered version of what Timothy O'Connor has already done. So Timothy O'Connor's book, Theism and Ultimate Explanations, and then a bunch of his papers, he's already kind of dealt with this better than whatever I'm about to say, because I can't quite remember all the details. So if you want to say that God's a necessary being, you say he necessarily exists and he's got a set of essential properties. One of those essential properties is free will. And so just part of what it means to have free will is the ability or you're the source of your actions, and you've got the ability to perform one thing or another. And you do so for reasons, because free actions are intentional actions, things that an agent intends to bring about for a reason. And so what O'Connor does is he says, like, well, what a PSR demands is that anything how does this go? Anything that's contingent, that contingently exists, needs an explanation. And then when you look at, well, why does God perform this action instead of some other action? He's going to be like, well, he does so for reasons. And there you go. You got an explanation. Why does God work on these particular set of reasons? There's no deeper story to tell. It's just what recognizing reasons is, and acting on a reason is just going, that's the reason I act. So he thinks like it just kind of bottoms out there. So he doesn't think there's a conflict with the PSR. But I can't remember all the details of how his PSR goes. There's a little bit more to the story than what I've just told you.
Yeah,
so that might be deeply unsatisfying.
No, it actually is great because I like Timothy O'Connor, and he actually, another thing he says is like, if there's something that doesn't need, or something that can't have a further explanation, you need some explanation why you can't have. It's something like that.
Mhm.
I would agree. Yeah, I think like I'm a libertarian. I believe reasons have that sort of explanatory role. So on classical theism, O'Connor actually wrote a paper called Simplicity in Creation. And he
Mhm.
basically holds to a view of simplicity. And he says that God's libertarian free act to create the world, he kind of goes for this extrinsic idea, but he applies it to libertarian free will, says his desires are necessary, but his desires don't necessitate, any particular world, because he obviously doesn't want to say that desires determine actions in like a, in a deterministic sense, because then there wouldn't be libertarian freedom. But he says there's like an indeterministic relation between God's desires and the world. So that's all I wanted to ask, and for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so it's been a long time since I've read that paper from O'Connor, but I remember it. So one of the things he says, so he affirms libertarianism, but he also affirms that reasons are not causes. And so there's a lot of people who want to say that. Some other people want to say reasons are causes, and not in an efficient causation kind of way, but maybe like a final cause or a teleological cause or something like that. But O'Connor's just like, it's not cause. Reasons aren't causes. That's weird. Reasons can't cause anything, but they explain. And so he's like, okay, cool. Well, God's actions aren't caused. He's got reasons. Reasons aren't causes. Now, the desire stuff, though, I don't think that's really fully consistent with classical theism, because so many classical theists, when you look at the tradition, say God does not have desires, because he could not possibly have desires, because he is the most valuable thing in the world. He's got everything he needs. He's fully satisfied in himself. And then they'll kind of even like make fun of people who think that God has desires and that's why he creates the universe. And they're like, no, God doesn't like need anything. He doesn't have any desires for anything. And they'll make a big like song and dance out of this kind of stuff. So I think that O'Connor's paper in that regards then is inconsistent with the classical view. And I know elsewhere he just thinks that like divine simplicity is traditionally understood. He just thinks that's crazy. And he's also an open theist because he doesn't think God knows the future. So I really don't know like how far to go with that defense that he gave. I think it could fit other models of God, but I don't think it fits classical theism.
All right. Thanks for answering the question. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay. Next up, I'm gonna unmute Timber. But before that, I just wanted to ask: do you think that when it comes to desires, that they're dispositional at any level, or do you think that they're not dispositional at all?
Oh, that's a good. Yeah. I want to say they are dispositional because I think desires, well, or at least desires are grounded in dispositions. It depends on what you want to do with emotions and whatnot. So emotions, I think, are grounded in dispositions, and then desires are like always future oriented. So you desire something if you currently don't have something, and you want the world to be a particular way, and then that would give rise to different emotions. So I think desires usually are, as far as I can tell, usually some kind of dispositional like thing.
So,
But I
do you
haven't
think
fully figured out the ontology there.
do you think they're causal then? Like they factor, like they do cause people to act a certain way or factor into their behavior somehow.
If you think reasons are causes, then you would say desires are causes, because desires are usually one subset of reasons. If you don't think that reasons are causes, then you'd say the same thing about desires. So it wouldn't. Yeah. So I don't know what to say about that particular debate. But
Okay.
that's the answer would be, if you think reasons are causes, desires, well, those are reasons, so they're going to be causes. If you don't
Yeah,
think that reasons are causes, then same thing, that is desires.
I see. Yeah, okay. I'm gonna unmute Timber now so he can ask some questions. Okay, go ahead, Timber.
Oh, hi. So I just wanted to follow up on your answer about the Trinity. So I think you said something like you consider them one God because they're like inseparable. And I may have misheard you, but did you say inseparable something like they couldn't exist, one couldn't exist without the other kind of thing?
Yeah, that's the Endel's view. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, let's say there's like this like what we would consider like a polytheistic religion that posited like n gods where each god is metaphysically necessary, then if we analyze that count like couldn't exist without each other, it would be the case that since all of them are metaphysically necessary, they couldn't exist without each other, right? So perhaps you have a different account. Maybe, is that? I was just wondering what you thought about that, and then
No, that's right. So this is this is why I should restate what the claim was that from Yandel, because maybe I didn't get something across. So Yandel's claim is that it is. I didn't say this part. He says it's logically impossible, and so he thinks logical necessity is stronger than metaphysical necessity. So he thinks it's logically impossible for the divine persons to exist apart from each other because they are necessarily and essentially strongly internally related to one another. That's the phrase he uses. So there's some kind of logical necessity going on here, and there's some kind of internal relation going on here that he didn't get to spell out before he died. And so that whatever that kind of spelling out is, that's supposed to be the difference between polytheism. Because yeah, you're right. If you had a bunch of just metaphysically necessary beings, of course they couldn't exist without each other, but they're not essentially and necessarily internally related to one another in this kind of way that whatever Yandel's trying to gesture towards.
Oh, okay. So then I would assume that if like a religion stated that they thought they were like, it's kind of like logically necessary for these gods to sort of, that each god is like, let's say, logically necessary, that would be
that their relationship to each other is logically necessary.
But presumably if they even said something stronger, like each of them is logically necessary, would that also count?
Maybe. I don't know. I hadn't thought about that. I think that's a really interesting point. Yeah, I don't know. But I think you're pushing on the right buttons. Yeah.
Just another a little bit unrelated question, but I just wanted to know, like, what do you think? There's like this view of like divine simplicity, but I just wanted to know what you thought about this idea that the kind of only property which is essential to divine beings is the property of being divine. Essentially saying that divinity is some kind of primitive notion. Like, what do you think about that?
Well, divine simplicity says no properties,
No,
no
I know.
no universals. So what is this view then?
No, I'm just saying. Maybe what do you think about a view which just takes divinity to be some sort of primitive that, and that's the only property which is sort of essential to God?
Oh, okay. So not necessarily divine simplicity, but just some other
Instead
view.
of something. Yeah.
There are a bunch of different people who kind of want to do this. I don't know, because when I think about what does it mean to be divine, I start counting up a bunch of properties, like all the omnis, for instance. And then, but some of the people are like, well, no, like the primitive properties, maybe it's like it's perfection. I'm like, cool. What does it mean to be perfect? Well, usually a lot of standard accounts to what it means to be perfect is you've got all the great making properties, and you've got them all to some sort of maximal degree. And I'm like, well, that's a bunch of properties then. So it sounds like divinity or perfection. It sounds like these are like functions or covering concepts for a cluster of properties. And I know like some people maybe like, let's say like Richard Swinburne or William Mann will go, no, this really is just like one property that these rest of these are derived from. I find that mysterious because it sounds like when I start unpacking the claim of what is it mean to be divine, I get a cluster of properties.
Oh, I see. Okay. So you see that like the concept of divine, like divinity is sort of composed of, let's say, omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, etc., like those kind of properties?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so we have a few more questions. Do you think so? What are your thoughts on negative existentials? And do you think that the concept of absolute nothingness is like coherent? Like, what do you think absolute nothingness is? Do you think it's something like a primitive?
Okay, so we got two separate questions here. So, negative existentials in general, just like unicorns don't exist. I guess I'm not actually. I guess I don't understand what the question is. Just what do I think about them?
No, but like, what's your account of I guess like negative existentials? Like, so if I said unicorns don't exist, what do you think is the truth maker for that? Do you believe in like negative existentials?
Oh, right. See, there we go. Okay, so this is, I think, negative existentials, they seem obviously true to me. Like, there are no unicorns. That seems right. Or the claim there are no unicorns in my room. Well, actually, that's not true. I bought a stuffed animal that is a unicorn for a friend when I was in Scotland last. So I do actually have a unicorn in my room. There are no beavers in my room. There we go. That seems obviously true. What makes it true? Well, nothing makes it true because there are no truth makers. Because truth makers are supposed to be like these positive things, and the absence of something can't be it. Well, this is just one more reason to go truth maker theory. Something fishy's going on here. There's something can't quite be right here.
I see. And the other question was, do you think that the concept of absolute nothingness is coherent? Like, if I said absolutely nothing exists or existed.
It's. I feel like it's epistemically possible because I can entertain the proposition of absolute nothingness. But is it metaphysically possible? I want to say no, because if you think that God is a necessarily existent being, then you couldn't have absolute nothingness. So I think in that sense it's incoherent. That given other things I know to be true, you just couldn't have that. So it's just merely epistemically possible, but not metaphysically possible.
Okay, I see. Okay, so we have a question here. Do you think angels exist?
Oh gosh, I got asked this question earlier this week from one of my colleagues. I don't know. I really don't know what to think about angels. So what I told my colleague earlier this week when she was asking, I was like, I'm just trying to figure out God right now. I'll think about angels later. I just don't know. Yeah, I really don't know.
I see. I have a follow-up to that question. If angels did exist, how many could fit on the head of a pin?
Yeah, I really like the scholastic answer to this, which is as many as you want, because the claim is from the scholastics is that non-physical objects, so like souls, they can have spatial location. The difference between non-physical objects and physical objects is that both can have spatial location, but physical objects are the sort of things that they take up space, and then they exclude other things from being other physical objects from being spatially located there. Whereas non-physical objects, they don't do that. So I exist right here. Yeah, well, so does God, because God's omnipresent. And then this one medieval thinker named Nicole Orsamy, he goes, remember that story in the Bible where Jesus encounters the man who was demon possessed with a bunch of different demons, and then he sends him off into the pigs. Nicole Orsamy is like, well, look, souls, demons, angels, all sorts of other non-physical objects, they can all be co-located because you can put as many there as you want because they don't take up space in the way that physical objects do. So that's what's going on there. And then he moves on to other topics. So yeah, so if that's the kind of way you understand non-physical objects in the relation to space, then yeah, you can put as many angels as you want onto the head of a pen.
Okay. That's a good answer. Joe asks, what are the best analytic theologians in your opinion?
Other than myself, obviously. No.
Yeah.
It depends what generation you're looking at. So you've got your first generation, which is people like Tom McCall and Oliver Crisp, and I think they're doing really good stuff. Then there's some of these younger generations that a lot of my friends that I think are doing really good work. And so people like Tim Paul, J.T. Turner, James Arcadi, Josh Ferris, and Jordan Wesling, and a bunch of these others. I think they're doing really excellent work. They don't have the same status as say someone like Oliver Crisp, but that's just because we haven't been around for long enough and we haven't published as much. But I find this next generation very, very, very promising and very exciting. So a great case in point is a book that finally came out yesterday, is the T&T Clark Handbook to Analytic Theology. A massive collection of essays from a lot of different people who are a part of these up and coming generations. And you've got people like Ali Pecavino and Akuva Sala in there as well. So I mean, I just think a lot of really great people doing really interesting work in this next generation of analytic theologians.
I see. The other question is, does God have propositional knowledge? And if not, what kind of knowledge does he have?
So I think he's got propositional knowledge, and I also think that he would have what's called phenomenal knowledge. So propositional knowledge is that something is the case. So God knows that the world exists or that the universe exists. But then the phenomenal knowledge is knowledge of what it's like. And so I think that God knows what it's like to create a universe, what it's like to experience the Big Bang, what it's like to experience witnessing the evolution of the universe take place, these sorts of things. So I would say God has both kinds of knowledge.
I see. Okay, so we're at 3:10 right now. Do you want to keep going, or do you want to like end it?
No, I can keep going. Like I cleared tonight entirely for this, especially since
okay.
since I had to change the date. So yeah, I've got all day. I've got all night.
Okay, all right. So we'll go for at least a few more minutes, and if we have more questions, we'll go for a little longer. So Peculiar Flower asks, who are the best defenders of atheism around, and do you think they make a good case for atheism?
I think there's some really good people. So Graham Oppie and Eric Wielenberg are like really obvious examples, and I think they're making really interesting cases. So I mean, and Michael Tooley is another really great example of this too. People who are very charitable towards theism, doing the best they can to accurately describe views, and giving really cogent arguments. So yeah, so I think those are the best people. But there's a second part of the question. What was the second part of the question? Or was there?
No, I don't think there was. It was just about whether you think there are any atheists that make a good case for atheism.
Okay, yeah. So those are some of the people I would identify as making good cases for atheism.
Okay, so Bate asks, do you think the principle of causality and the law of conservation of energy and mass supports eternalism over creationism? If you accept causality / conservation, are there principles that you hold to that contradict those two?
So I kind of understand what conservation is. I don't think I understand the principle of causality, just like that there's cause and effect.
Yeah, I'm not too sure about this question. You know what? I'm just gonna get Bait to. Oh, somebody says my mic is bad. Is my mic working fine? Can you guys hear me?
It's really, really quiet now.
Oh, I'm sorry. One second. Yeah. So I'm gonna unmute Bait, and if he's in here, what is he in here actually?
I thought it was.
Oh, okay, so he's elaborating. Causality, also referred to as causation. Okay, so yeah, that's not gonna clear anything up.
Okay,
Yeah, can you just rephrase your question? Oh, okay, it's that every cause has a prior cause, right?
yeah.
Yeah. So what he's asking is that, do you think the principle of causality and the law of conservation of energy and mass support eternalism over creationism? So I guess he's asking whether you think that it's support for some sort of like infinite regress.
Right. Okay. So I want to make sure I'm getting clear on the causal claim here. So the causal claim is all causes have a prior cause.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I would just think that's false then, because you'd get this infinite regress, and in which case I don't think you'd ever have an explanation for anything, because infinite regresses don't explain things. So yeah, I would just want to go that one's false. And then a bunch of people who are doing philosophy of physics, some of them like, so there's a guy, what's his name? Brian Pitts. I was talking to him 2 years ago. He was working on the interaction problem for souls. How could souls interact with bodies? Because some people say it violates the law of conservation. And he was like, who cares? The law of conservation doesn't really hold across the entire universe anyway. There's a bunch of different physical theories where the law of conservation doesn't hold. So what's the problem? And I just found that really shocking. And I invited him to come speak at a conference, but the conference has been put on hold indefinitely because of the pandemic. So the full details of that story are going to be forthcoming, I guess.
I see.
I would say that lacking an explanation doesn't mean that it's false. It just means that you don't know if it's true or false. Because if that was your criteria, you can just say that if God is necessary, then God does not have an explanation. Therefore, God is false.
I guess a lot of people think that the fact that he's a necessary being that's like self-explanatory. So that's where the explanation bottoms out. So you have an ultimate explanation. Whereas when you get an infinite regress, it's supposed to explain a particular thing. So like, here's a weird story. So Helsinki, they gave me my first paycheck, but I didn't have a finished bank account. And so I was like, okay, well, I need to cash this check. And so I go to the bank, and they're like, all right, well, you don't have a bank account here, but we can start one up for you. I'm like, cool. And they're like, but first, in order to pay you, we have to take this paycheck to our bank. And I'm like, you guys have a bank? And they're like, of course we have a bank. This is Finland. We got bureaucracy for everything. I'm like, okay. And so they go to their bank, so the bank's bank. And they go to the bank, and they're like, all right, we got to cash this check. And they're like, that's fine, sir. We can do this for you. We just got to go to our bank to cash this check. I'm like, okay, cool. So go to the bank to cash the check. Well, we get to the bank, and they're like, well, we have a bank for ours, for ourselves too before we cash this check. And then, and so on and so on and so on, and infinitely, a million banks here. Am I ever going to get paid? Seems like no, I'm never going to get paid. That's a problem. And so this is like one kind of account of how like infinite regresses, they don't really explain whatever they're supposed to. They never really get the job done.
That just means it's always the case. It's no different from something being necessary. If something is necessary, it's always going to be the case. Same for infinite regress.
That the infinite regress itself would always be the case?
Yes. But whatever is being explained by infinite regress is also the case, whether it be causality or time or what have you.
So I guess because the problem with infinite regress is that it doesn't explain whatever it is supposed to explain. So like the case of how will I get my paycheck, seems like it doesn't ever explain it. Whereas a necessarily existent being, it doesn't seem analogous to an infinite regress. So I think I'm just missing whatever point you're making.
How about this? If the difference of conservation was that if conservation is necessarily true, then conservation gets a regress. So to me, they're basically the same. Neither of those cases, where there's infinite regress or necessity, is ever not the case.
Do you mean causation or conservation of energy?
Anything that is necessary or falls into infinite regress is never not the case.
Yeah. I guess I could. Okay, so that they're always the case. I'm not certain if you could say that about the infinite regress because the infinite regress is like it has different parts that are not always the case, especially if you're looking at like say moments of time or something.
There was a bank before the bank, and there's a bank before the bank, and it's always the case that there's a bank above it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what falls into the infinite regress, is that necessity of the fact that there's a bank before it.
Yeah.
I'm saying
I guess I'm not seeing how it's analogous though. So keep going. Try it one more time.
The reason that you fall into the same problem is that when there's infinite regress with necessity, they both have a condition that is always the case, and that's what causes the problem of infinite regress, is that condition is always the case.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so I can understand that point, I guess. What I'm not seeing is how infinite regresses explain things.
It doesn't, in the same case that any necessary fact is a brute necessity, according to Epigram.
Oh, I see. Okay, so if it's a brute necessity, okay, yeah, but I guess I'm being denying it's a brute necessity because bruteness is like it's inexplicable. Whereas if you think something's metaphysically necessary or logically necessary, you wouldn't say it's inexplicable. You just say like that's where the explanation stops and it's self-explanatory. So that would be one difference, I guess. But I can see. I guess I think I'm starting to see your point though. Is if I take Oppie's view where it's like these are brute, that means it's inexplicable. Then I can see why that you could try to draw these sort of analogies between the two. I think that's right. I'm not. I need to think about this more.
All right.
So is there another question or?
Oh, sorry. I thought my mic was on. Yeah, we're seeing if there are any other questions. Okay, so we have a question from Peculiar Flower. What are your thoughts on panentheism and pantheism?
Mm-hmm. So the first two papers I wrote on panentheism were trying to argue that there is no such thing, that all attempts to demarcate panentheism from the different versions of theism and from pantheism collapse into one or the other. But then I got asked to write a paper for a forthcoming book on different models of God and this axiological question of should we want God to exist? So, like, if God exists, what kind of value would God bring to the world? And what this new book wants to do is look at different models of God and say, like, should we want a classical God to exist? Should we want an open theist God to exist? Should we want panentheist God or a pantheist God to exist? And so they asked me to do the chapter on panentheism. And I agreed to it. And so I was like, well, crap, I really need to figure out what is panentheism now. And so now that I've surveyed like most of the literature on it, the one of the few things I can find panentheists agreeing on is that creation out of nothing is false. And so I'm like, okay, cool. Classical theist, neoclassical theist, open theist, they want to say creation out of nothing is true. Panentheism says that's false. And I'm like, all right, fine. At least I can say that there's that much of a distinction. Beyond that, I can't find anything that's really that any panentheist agrees on at all. So if I want to take panentheism seriously, at least say it's got this much, that it's got some kind of eternal creation, that God always exists with the universe of some sort. There could be something going for that view. So there's a very ancient principle called the principle of plenitude, which is that goodness just it just has to it's necessarily diffusive. It just has to create more goodness. And if you think that's plausible, then you might think, well, then panentheism's got a lot going for it, because just part of the nature of God is such that God just has to create more and more stuff, to add more and more value to the world. And so God always has to exist with something or other. And so creation ex nihilo would be false. Things would always exist. There's something would always exist alongside God, because God would just have to create. I think you could develop some arguments for that. I think there could be something going for that, and you might be able to say that's attractive in some sense.
So the next question is, so why should one think that aseity is an essential property of God? Is there a philosophical argument for it, or is it like biblical? Is it just scriptural like evidence?
I think there's minimal scriptural evidence for God being an independent being. A lot of times when I look at discussions of aseity in contemporary literature, not necessarily in historical thinkers, but contemporary literature, they usually want to build in all their other attributes. So like James Dozel's account of aseity basically just builds in divine simplicity and impassibility and all this other stuff right into it. And I'm like, well, that's not what's going on here. So aseity, as I said quite a while ago, just means God is ase if and only if his existence is not dependent upon nor derived from something outside of himself. Now, you could have some different perfect being intuitions that are at play here. So a perfect being is supposed to have all the great making properties that are better to have than not have. And you might think, well, existence seems like a pretty cool property. Something is better that something have existence than not exist. And maybe you say it's better that it necessarily exists than not necessarily exist. Well, aseity is another property that seems like really important, because it'd be better to not have your existence dependent upon something than it would be to have your existence dependent upon something. Because you might think, well, you're really not that great if your existence is dependent upon something else. You're really not that great or perfect or the greatest possible being if your existence is dependent upon other things. So whatever the perfect thing is, whatever the greatest thing is going to have to be, well, it can't be dependent on anything else for its existence. So it's got to have aseity. So I think those are something like that are the kinds of philosophical arguments you can give for aseity. Biblically, I think you can kind of assume it. If God's a thing that's like supposed to be like the creator of all things visible and invisible, that would kind of strongly suggest or assume that he's got aseity. But I don't think there's like a passage where it says like, thus saith the Lord, I am ase.
I see. What is your favorite response to arguments from divine hiddenness?
Ooh, I haven't thought about hiddenness in a while. I haven't thought about hiddenness in a couple of years. For a while, I kind of liked Eleanor Stump's account. But then John Hick has this other one that I think is kind of interesting too. I'll run Hick's argument because there's some funny stuff you can do with it. So John Hick's account basically is there needs to be some kind of what he calls epistemic distance between God and creatures in order for creatures to actually develop their own character freely. And so epistemic distance just means they can't be fully aware of God all the time. Because if you're fully aware of God all the time, you might not really, develop your character in the right kind of way. So here's some examples of this. So when I was 16 years old, I was at a Christian youth conference, and one of the speakers was like, don't do anything that you wouldn't do if Jesus was in the room with you. And me being a really crass 16-year-old was thinking about that. I'm like, don't do anything that I wouldn't do if Jesus was in the room. I was like, there's a bunch of stuff I wouldn't do if Jesus was in the room. I'm not going to use the bathroom if Jesus is in the room. That's awkward. I probably wouldn't watch TV because it would be rude. Be like, oh, Jesus, nice to meet you. Hang on a second. I'm just, catching up on Desperate Housewives here. And I certainly wouldn't have sex with my wife if Jesus were in the room. That's really awkward. So this doesn't seem like the right kind of principle. And so John Hick can go, right. If you are too aware of God's presence, that might be kind of crippling in terms of your decision making and in terms of your ability to really have some kind of sense of autonomy and develop your own character freely. So I think you can get a lot of traction out of that. I don't think it gives you the full answer to the problem of divine hiddenness, but I think it gives you an interesting start, at least.
But then, in the case where he reveals himself to the apostles, they experience something like that? Would they not want to go to the bathroom and stuff like that?
Can you repeat that? Because your mic cut out for a second.
Okay, I'm sorry. In the case where he reveals himself to the apostles, wouldn't they also experience what you described, not wanting to go to the bathroom and stuff like that? And if not, then why would that occur to anyone else?
Oh yeah, because I think that they probably did have that experience of not wanting to do all sorts of stuff in front of him, but they could get away from him for a while too. And a bunch of them did get away from him. Judas was able to get away from him for a while and did all sorts of crazy stuff behind his back. And the emphasis on behind his back. So he got away from his presence. So his presence in bodily form is limited to so you wouldn't be experiencing his presence in the way that I guess, and you'd still be moderating your behavior accordingly.
I see. Okay. Have you ever reviewed other religions? And also, what's your best argument for specifically Christianity being true as opposed to other theistic religions?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So I think it's only within the last several years that I've been giving a lot more attention to different religions. So I mentioned, I think at the beginning, that I briefly taught at a boarding school. And so during that time, I was teaching world religions from a philosophical perspective. And so that was, I think, the first moment where I was really trying to dig in a lot deeper into the different religions and try to present them as best as I could to the arguments for and against each one to the students. So that way they can make up their mind themselves. And so they could really see the arguments and walk through the arguments themselves. And so that's kind of an ongoing project right now of trying to figure out, different religious claims and the philosophical arguments for and against them. At the moment, I would say Kalam, cosmological argument, those I think do a good job at ruling out Buddhism and a lot of different versions of Hinduism, because most schools of thought within Hinduism deny creation out of nothing and think that the universe has always existed. So I think that kind of stuff does a good job at ruling those things out. But that still leaves Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And so I would say historical arguments for the resurrection of Jesus, I think those are the ones that kind of would push me towards Christianity.
Wait, but couldn't material things exist timelessly? Couldn't you have something that existed that didn't undergo any change and just existed in a state of timelessness? That wasn't God.
Oh, that God didn't create?
Yeah. That's something that was a co-eternal.
There are some accounts of different within different Hindu thinkers where it seems like they've kind of got this prime matter, but I find prime matter really mysterious because it's this material stuff that doesn't seem to have corporeality exactly, Doesn't seem like it actually really like takes up space. It seems like it's lacking a mass. I really kind of lose my grasp on how this is matter anymore. But maybe you could just go, well, maybe there's just like some actual matter, like a singularity that's just been hanging around with God. That's got all of matter and energy, like in it. That's like co-eternal with God. I guess that's fine. But you'd still have the Kalam worries of like, are they like, well, no, because I've got other responses to that would be consistent with this. Yeah, I guess that's fine. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
But this, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So Jonathan wanted to ask another question. Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah, there was talk about aseity, and obviously, I'm sure you're aware of the like Platonist debate that's been going on in theistic circles, and like some people want to say that God creates Platonic objects, which is really, really weird. You get into a bootstrapping issue. Then you have people like Van den Wagen who just kind of bite the bullet.
Yeah.
What is your view, particularly?
It depends what day of the week you ask me, because there are some days where I'm like, what Peter Van den Wagen's up to seems fine. He's like, oh, it turns out God didn't create, the number 2. Oh, wow, God's not sovereign anymore. And I'm like, yeah, it seems like a fair response. But I'm quite attracted to the idea that you just move the Platonic realm into the mind of God. So it's sometimes called the Augustinian move. That seems fine to me, because this is just a very long tradition of what's called the divine ideas. And God doesn't create the divine ideas; God just has them. So I quite like that. But
so like a conceptualist, like a divine conceptualist,
something kind of like that. Yeah.
One more thing, Van den Wagen has this. He says that in John 1, when it says God created all things, or through the word, God created all things, and then in the Nicene Creed it says God created all things. Like, he interprets the quantifier there to just not be talking about abstract objects. Do you think that that's plausible from a historical perspective? That's what John had in mind when he said all things.
So Keith Yandel weighs in on this too, because I don't know if you've maybe read the Beyond the Control of God, the 5 Views book. And so Keith points out some different biblical passages where it says God creates all things that have been made. And so Keith's like, right, that have been made. The number 2 cannot be made. You can't make, propositions. So they're not things that have been made. So there's some kind of qualification right there in the biblical text. And then Keith also looks at the Nicene Creed and some others, and he's just like, now you mean to tell me that when they're massively having these massive political fights and these massive debates about the Trinity and whatnot, that they had in mind this worry about Platonic, abstract objects? That just no. And my own take when I've read quite a bit on what's going on at that time period and going on in these different debates and stuff, those people are just awful political fights, just backstabbing each other and everything. That's awful. The idea that they were sitting down and going, I wonder if God created pi or the number 7. I'm like, no, they're trying to figure out how to screw that guy over there, politically, and they're just no. I don't think they were worried about abstract objects.
Yeah, I kind of get that. Like when I think about Athanasius, I don't exactly think that Athanasius was thinking through whether or not God created abstract objects or not. So it's weird for Van den Wagen to interpret, at least in the Nicene Creed, the quantifier that way.
Yeah, so it seems like this might cut against a couple different people going like they didn't have that in mind or they did have that in mind, depending on what you want to do with that. I just don't think they had it in mind. I just don't think they were even considering this kind of debate that we're talking about at the moment. I don't think they even had that as in view.
All right, yeah, I pretty much agree with you. Thanks.
Okay, Glossy Primate asks, how do you respond to the randomness walk objection to libertarian free will?
The randomness what objection to free will?
Oh, walk objection. So he's saying how is it not the case that a person's decisions would just be random under libertarian free will if there's nothing causing them or necessitating them?
Oh, I see. Okay. So if you take the view that reasons are not causes, you still think reasons are explanations. So reasons. There's this guy named Ollie Pearson who has a book that came out a few years ago called Rationality, Time, and Self, where he looks at just intentional actions, reasons, the relationship between emotions and the role that they play in our reasons, and then time and some kind of argument for the soul. And so he says there's like three kinds of things that reasons do. One is they explain the motivation. They explain for your action. They explain the justification for your action. And then what was the other one? Oh wait, no, explanation is explain your action, motivate your action, and justify your action. Yeah, I think those are the three things they do. So they don't cause on Pearson's view, but they motivate your action, they explain your action, and then they justify your action. And those are the roles that reason play.
How can they motivate without causing? It seems like what does it mean to say that something motivates without causing?
So I recognize that just by looking at a baby, I can just recognize that I ought not to stomp on it just to hear it squeak. Does that cause me not to stomp on it? Well, no, because I just don't stomp on it. But I recognize the value there. I can just see it, I perceive it.
But isn't the recognition of the value sort of causing you not to do it? Like, don't you, aren't you less likely to have the mental state of I'm going to stomp on this baby when you perceive the value of the baby?
So if you want it, you could say it's a cause, because there's a bunch of libertarians who are happy to say that. It doesn't seem like efficient causation to me. And when I reflect on my mental states, it doesn't necessarily seem like it's efficient causation. If you want to call it cause, it seems like it's what you would refer to as like a final cause or a teleological cause, like the Aristotelian understanding of cause. But that just doesn't seem like it's efficient causation. I'm somewhat agnostic on this point because libertarians are also just divided on this.
I see. Yes, the quasi-primate says it seems like it could be still a stochastic kind of cause, and I kind of agree with him that it does seem like a stochastic cause.
Like this, like sort of random?
Well, like like probabilistic.
Oh, okay. If it's really explanatory in the way like Pearson and others talk about, well, then it wouldn't be just probable, because it really would explain my action. So why do when I get back to America, why am I going to order a cheeseburger from Wendy's? Well, because I think Wendy's is the best place to get a cheeseburger from. I just need to get winded. That explains it. It doesn't raise the probability that I'll do it. It just explains my action. I guess I've never really quite understood the motivation to be like reasons just raise the probability.
I see. My other question. So that was Glossy Primate's question.
Mm-hmm.
My question is regarding Ed Feser's Aristotelian argument. What do you think is the issue with the first 14 premises, at the end of which it says, so there's a purely actualized actualizer, or sorry, there's a purely actual actualizer? Like, what do you think is the issue with the argument? Like, which premises do you reject?
I don't remember all the premises because it's got like 32,
I have
40.
it in the text chat.
You got in the group chat. Okay, let me look, because I just remember when I was reading through it, just remember thinking I'd reject that one and that one and that one. Yeah, so I don't know. Okay, so let me open this up here.
If you want, I can just DM it to you. It's fine.
So no, I see it. So change is a feature of the world. That seems fine. But change is the actualization of a potential. So the actualization of a potential is a real feature of the world. No potential can be actualized unless something already actualizes it. No potential can be actualized. Okay. So any change is caused by something already actual. The occurrence of any change, C, presupposes something or substance S which changes. The existence of S. Where does he get to the point where I want to say because I want to say at some point he like sneaks in something where it's like something outside of it has to actualize the potential. Where is that part? Is that in this argument maybe? Or it might be buried in a bunch of these that I'm just not bothering to respond to read out.
Oh yeah, it's 12.
yeah.
It says so either A is itself is a purely actual actualizer, or there is a purely actual actualizer which terminates the regress that begins the actualization of A. So it's 12.
Yeah.
Uh,
Okay.
yeah,
So
see,
yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
he's committing some sort of like almost like maybe like a scope. I'm not sure what kind of fallacy this would be, but he just inserts purely in here, and I don't know why. Like he doesn't
Yeah.
elaborate on why it has to be purely.
It's
Um,
it's a ancient principle that Aquinas uses, but a bunch of others have floating around. So you see this in Islamic and Jewish thinkers from the same time period. Is that if because they take act and potency to be like composed things, and so there's this assumption that anything that's composed, it has to have something else outside of it that composes it, and then you've got some
yeah,
kind of other similar principle that if something is you need something that's purely actual that could actualize potentials. Richard Cross is one of many people who's pointed out that this is just really weird, and you could just say God is actually exists. He actually has powers, and those powers are dispositions. They're powers. They can be exercised in various ways. Well, God actually exists and actually has those powers, and so he just exercises them how he wants. You don't need something outside of God to somehow get God to exercise those powers. That's weird.
nice.
And so Richard Cross like really dismisses it very quickly. And yeah, there's a bunch of other people who do the same. But yeah, that's one medieval scholar who goes, this is just a particular assumption that doesn't seem plausible and we don't need to make. And that's one of many assumptions I think that's going on in a lot of Phaser's arguments that he doesn't state.
Yeah, in premise 9, he says A's own existence at the moment it actualizes S itself presupposes either A, the concurrent actualization of its own potential for existence, or B, A's being purely actual. Right? So I don't understand like why. I think he's saying that if it's not purely actual, it has to be actualized by something else. But it seems like, well, why couldn't it be actual without being actual, without being purely actual, right?
Mhm.
It could
Yeah.
be actual that's, not purely actual, right? Like something else. And I think you're correct in saying that his motivation for saying this is that, if a being is composed of like act and potency, right, then, or if he's not divinely simple, then it can't be like actual. Like, it has to have something else explaining it. But that just seems kind of like counterintuitive to how most people. I mean, at the very least, it's going to lead to very counterintuitive results, right? So we could just do some sort of like Morian shift and say, look, if we're gonna have to bite all these bullets that seem completely like insane to most people, why not just reject this principle, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's what myself and anyway like Graham Oppie and Alan Rhoda and others do is just go, that just seems really implausible. I've got some other principles that I find much more plausible than this one. Other causal principles that are just much more obvious. And so it seems really counterintuitive. But then again, I said that this principle that Phaser has kind of snuck in. It was really intuitive to like loads of people in the Middle Ages. They all thought it was like just obvious. So if I were to go back in time, they would think I was nuts. They'd be like, "What are you talking about?" And so it would just be me and Al Ghazali going, "You guys are crazy," and everybody else would think we were nuts. Whereas today, a lot of people go, "No, you guys are crazy." We're plausible. So I find it implausible and counterintuitive, but to be charitable to people who are dead, they would say, "No, it's perfectly obvious."
I see. Kant asks, does Nicene Christianity claim that the Son is begotten in his essence or personhood?
So the claim is he's begotten, not made, and begotten is genitos in the Greek, and then made is genitos in the Greek. There's just an extra letter that they throw in there, and the difference is supposed to be that begotten means it's an eternal cause with an eternal effect. So the Father eternally causes the Son to exist, and somehow also causes him to have the same divine essence. So it causes him to exist and causes him to have the same essence. Whereas created, it's something that's caused to exist and it has a beginning to its existence. So it's not an eternal. It's an eternal cause, but it's a temporal or finite effect. And then the Father, when the Father creates, the Father's not making the created stuff like have the same divine essence. So that's the Nicene claim. But is it coherent as a separate question? But yeah, that's the claim in Nicaea.
Okay. 1 second. So Bartholomew just wanted to ask a question in voice chat. Let me just try to see if he's here. Can't seem to find him. All right, that's fine.
Yeah, I don't see him
I
either.
guess my kind of final question, because I do want to wrap this up in a few minutes. What is your favorite book of the Bible and why?
Oh goodness. Maybe the Book of Jude, because well, first it's really short and that's kind of cool. And so when you're teaching Sunday school classes, it's just an easy book to get through. And so I was teaching a Sunday school class in Georgia many years ago, and I got to have all sorts of fun puns and ridiculous lines that I had with it because so Jude quotes the Book of Enoch, and then it also quotes the Assumption of Moses. And so I was able to use the line, "What happens when you assume you make an ass out of you and me," and everything. So I was able to say the word "ass" in a Sunday school classroom because of the Book of Jude. So those are ridiculous reasons to pick Jude as a favorite book, but that's what I'll stick with for the moment.
Funny. So Bartholomew, just you're up.
Cool.
He's here now. Bartholomew, just you're unmuted.
Yes. So when we talk about God and God having emotions, a lot of people put him under this umbrella as if he's like kind of like if he's like a human. The last time God was human was Jesus Christ. So if anybody has ever asked questions about him being emotional, how would you answer that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the things I do in the new book, God and Emotion, is I point out that historically, classical theists themselves have said God has at least one emotion. Some want to say he has maybe some others. So an emotion is a felt evaluation of a situation. So it's some kind of evaluation of something, and there's something that it's like to have that evaluation. And so classical theists, what they said was, well, God has an evaluation of himself as the greatest being. He's the greatest good. And what's it like to be in the right relationship with the greatest good? Well, it's amazing. It's pure bliss. It's pure felicity. It is pure, undisturbable joy. And so they're like, yeah, God's got that. He's got undisturbed happiness. And you see this in a lot of different thinkers throughout the classical traditions, like very adamant that God is in a state of pure, undisturbed happiness. And so what Anastasia Scrutton points out in her book on God and Emotions, this book called Thinking Through Feeling, when she looks at the classical traditions, she says our contemporary word for our English word for emotion, it actually covers a bunch of different affective states that more classical thinkers would have had two different kinds of distinctions with. So you would have passions on the one side and affections on the other side, whereas our English word emotions covers all of that. And so the passions could be things that might be purely physical. They might be irrational, or they could be irrational in some cases. Whereas affections on the other end, those are things that don't necessarily have to involve having a body, and they could be perfectly rational. And so she's like Augustine and Aquinas and a bunch of others. They think that God has affections, but they don't think he has passions. That's why he's impassible. No passions. But emotions, or the affections, those are fine because they're rational. They're good. Pure bliss seems great. And so they're happy to say that about God.
So people tend to reject God because of some sort of evil that happens in life, or the evil that happens in the world. How would you answer someone that would reject God for these very reasons?
Oh, just like basic problem of evil kind of stuff?
Yeah, like my mother got sick, my dad got sick, someone in my family died. How could this happen to me? Some sort of, those emotions of how could God do this to me since he's so great?
Right. I don't have time to give a full theodicy, but I guess I would just so instead I'll just gesture wildly towards I think like John Hick's soul building theodicy. I think there's a lot there that's really, really good that gives, I think, good explanations and good kind of account of these sort of issues. I think the way that Swinburne and William Hasker have tried to develop the soul building theodicy, I think, is quite good. But that's a very long story to fill in all those details. But that's, well, okay. I don't know if I would just tell someone that though. If like, so for instance, when I was a youth minister, one of the kids in the group died in a car accident, and there was no way I was going to walk up to them when everybody found out about it, and we were all like just break down crying. I wasn't going to walk up and be like, "No, consider the following argument." So yeah, the context of when I would run some kind of theodicy, I think would that's a certain kind of question. I wouldn't just go around just throwing out theodicies at people all the time.
All right, thank you very much, bud.
All right, so so if anybody has any more questions, I'll take like one more question, and if not, I'll just ask my own.
I guess I
Yeah,
had
so-
one, dog.
Oh, okay, yeah, go ahead, John.
One of the things that I've always found, because I obviously lean into classical theism, that I've always found amazing about the incarnation is like the idea of a timeless God experiencing time insofar as he's a human. And obviously the view of time that you hold to, I think, is like a sort of Craig's view, which is that God enters into time and he kind of changes along with time. Do you think that sort of, and this isn't an argument against non-classical theism, but do you think that sort of takes away from the uniqueness of the incarnation when you say that God already was experiencing time prior to the incarnation? And do you kind of get the intuition I'm getting at?
No, I understand what you're talking about. Yeah, because a lot of people try to push this. Like Tom Winandi does this as well. So first, I don't affirm Craig's view because Craig says God's timeless without the universe and temporal with the universe. I find that very mysterious, and so I just want to be like, God's always temporal. Just that. What I'm doing actually now, the current project is something even crazier, which is just saying God is time itself. But that's a story for another day. Yeah. So that's really crazy stuff. But Isaac Newton thought it was true. But Isaac Newton also had a nervous breakdown, so you could say he's crazy too. So whatever. So the incarnation, though. So I think what is utterly unique about the incarnation is that you have a divine person not only becoming fully human, so like taking on like a human nature, but also undergoing the human experience. And I don't think that I think that's what's fully unique, what's going on there. I don't think undergoing succession and just experiencing one thing after another is unique to humans, because I think dolphins have that. Cats have that. They experience succession. So I don't think there's anything necessarily unique to humans about that. And I want to say God experiences succession, so I don't think anything's terribly unique. So God did one thing and then another, and then he became incarnate. I don't see how that would undermine the uniqueness of the incarnation, because it's still like you've got God the Son becoming like fully human. That's pretty darn unique. Just because he had a little bit of succession before that, I don't see why that would undermine the uniqueness.
Yeah, as long as you saw the intuitive, because at least for me, it seems really intuitive. But I also don't think if you hold to a view that God is temporal, that I'm not trying to say that your view like disparages the incarnation or something. I didn't want to come off that way, and I apologize.
No.
I thought you held to Craig's view.
No, that's okay. No, I can see why people would think they hold to Craig's view. But yeah, no, I don't think it's disparaging. But yeah, no, I've seen this objection a lot. But I've kind of thought like, I don't think undergoing a change and succession is like a uniquely human thing. Whereas the incarnation, it seems like that's the unique claim is he really becomes fully human. So yeah, I would want to see like some more details, because all I ever see usually is that intuition you're pointing out.
Right.
So I'd like to see some more to really feel the force of it, though.
Okay. Well, one more thing, because I got dog asked me. I saw one time, what is this thing about essence energies? Like, because I saw you and Nemish when you were on Capturing Christianity. It came up, and I've gotten into some talk with my Orthodox friends about it, and for me, it's like hard to understand what they're saying, or what they're saying reduces down to either, a a neoclassical theist view or a classical theist view, and it's like depending on the Orthodox I talk to, it's like completely different. So like, what is your view?
My view is it depends which Orthodox thinker you talk to. Because I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. Sometimes I'm like, that's just utterly mysterious. Other times I'm like, that's just classical theism with some funny ways of talking, or that's just what everybody who's not a classical theist wants to say. And then you'll find people who are Eastern Orthodox going, that's exactly right. To every single one of those. So yeah, I think it depends who you ask. Yeah.
It is a generally confusing thing. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right, so I guess we're gonna wrap it up. Do you have any like promotional content or any like books or websites that you want to promote?
Sure. So if you go to rtmullins.com, you'll find not all of my papers, but I try to make a lot of my papers available there. So that way, if you don't have access to like an academic library, you can see the stuff there. My podcast, the Reluctant Theologian podcast, which is on like Spotify and iTunes and all those other crazy apps you might use. And then I'm also doing more YouTube video interviews than I can keep up with, and so I'm trying to put all of those on the website on my website when they come along. But I just can't keep up with the number of interviews I've been asked to do. But I try to put them all there.
Right. I linked everything in your AMA text chat. All right then. So thank you for coming, Ryan Mullins. I hope to see you again at some point in the future.